In the annals of military history, there are few miscalculations as profound as the German command's underestimation of the United States 8th Air Force. It was a failure of strategic intelligence, a triumph of arrogance over reason, and a catastrophic misreading of American industrial will. The Luftwaffe High Command, led by Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring and his senior generals, looked at the American bomber force in 1942 and saw a collection of inexperienced crews flying outdated aircraft. They dismissed the American strategic bombing doctrine as a theoretical fantasy. They believed that the Flying Fortress, with its 10 machine guns, was a fragile construct that would shatter under the weight of German fighter attacks. Yet by 1945, the 8th Air Force had become the most powerful aerial armada in human history. It had dropped over 600,000 tons of bombs on Nazi Germany, destroyed the Luftwaffe in the air, and reduced German cities to rubble. It was the instrument that broke the back of the German war machine. This is the story of that underestimation, a story of tactical blindness, industrial miscalculation, and the crushing weight of American production. It is a story that answers the question, why did German command underestimate the U.S. 8th Air Force? And what does that underestimation tell us about the true nature of the Second World War? To understand why German command underestimated the 8th Air Force, one must first understand the strategic culture from which both the American and German air forces emerged. The United States Army Air Forces, the precursor to the independent U.S. Air Force, was built on a doctrine of precision daylight bombing. This doctrine, developed at the Air Corps Tactical School in the 1930s, held that heavily armed bombers flying in tight formations could penetrate enemy airspace, destroy specific industrial targets, and win wars without the need for costly ground campaigns. The Norden bombsight, a top-secret device, was the centerpiece of this doctrine. Under test conditions, it was said, the Norden could place a bomb in a barrel from 20,000 feet. The Americans believed that their bombers were self-defending. The B-17 Flying Fortress, with its 10.50 caliber machine guns, was designed to fight its way through enemy fighter defenses. The B-24 Liberator, with its greater range and payload, was equally formidable. The American airmen were confident that their formation tactics, their training, and their technology would be sufficient to defeat any enemy fighter force. The German command, in stark contrast, looked at the American bomber formations and saw a slow, lumbering target. The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots, flying the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190, had already proven their superiority over European skis. The Luftwaffe had defeated the air forces of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. The American bombers, the Germans believed, would be no different. This underestimation was a product of several factors. First, the Germans had no experience with long-range strategic bombing. Their own bomber force was designed for tactical support of ground operations. They had never attempted to build a force of heavy bombers capable of attacking targets thousands of miles away. Second, the Germans were victims of their own propaganda. The Nazi regime had spent years telling the German people that the Americans were soft, decadent, and lacking in military spirit. The Luftwaffe High Command believed that the Americans would not have the stomach for the heavy losses that daylight bombing would inevitably produce. Third, the Germans underestimated the industrial capacity of the United States. They did not understand the scale of American production. They could not conceive of a force that could build thousands of heavy bombers, train thousands of crews, and sustain a strategic bombing campaign for years on end. The American 8th Air Force, under the command of General Ira C. Eaker, arrived in England in 1942 with high hopes and limited resources. The first combat operations took place in August 1942, with limited raids against targets in occupied France. These early missions were tentative, exploratory. The Americans were learning the realities of combat over Europe. The Germans observed these early raids with interest but no alarm. The American bombers were accurate, but they were also vulnerable. The Luftwaffe quickly learned that its defensive armament, while formidable, was not invulnerable. German pilots developed tactics to attack the bomber formations head-on, exploiting the weak spots in the formation's defensive fire. The German command believed that the American bombing offensive would collapse under the weight of German fighter attacks. They believed that the American losses would be so heavy, so unsustainable, that the 8th Air Force would be forced to abandon its daylight campaign and join the British in night bombing. It was a catastrophic miscalculation that would cost Germany the war. The turning point in the German underestimation of the 8th Air Force came during the disastrous raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg in August and October 1943. These missions exposed the vulnerabilities of unescorted bombers and demonstrated the German fighter force's deadly effectiveness. In August 1943, the 8th Air Force launched its most ambitious mission to date. The plan was a double strike against the Messerschmitt factory in Regensburg and the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt. The Regensburg strike would hit first, drawing off the defending Luftwaffe fighters, clearing the way for the Schweinfurt force. The Regensburg bombers would then continue over the Alps to North Africa, the first American shuttle bombing mission. The operation was a disaster. The Regensburg force, flying without fighter escort, was pounced upon by an estimated 300 Luftwaffe fighters. The German fighters, some armed with air-to-air rockets for the first time, tore into the bomber formations. Of the 230 attacking B-17s, 36 were shot down, with the loss of 200 men. Combined with the Regensburg raid earlier in the day, a total of 60 B-17s were lost. The damage to the factories was only temporary. The Germans had been warned, and they had not been defeated. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943 was even worse. This day would become known as Black Thursday. Of the 291 attacking fortresses, 59 were shot down over Germany, 1 ditched in the English Channel, 5 crashed in England, and 12 more were scrapped due to battle damage. A total of 77 B-17s were lost. 122 bombers were damaged to some degree and needed repairs before their next flight. The Luftwaffe, however, had also suffered significant losses, but the German High Command was euphoric. They had proven that the American bombers were vulnerable. They believed that the American bomber offensive had been broken, that the 8th Air Force would never again venture deep into Germany without fighter escort. They were wrong. The Americans were not broken. They were learning. The Schweinfurt missions had demonstrated the critical need for long-range fighter escort. The P-47 Thunderbolt had excellent firepower and produced an effective short-range escort, but its range was limited. The P-38 Lightning was better, but it was still not capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin. The solution was the P-51 Mustang, a fighter that would transform the air war over Europe. The P-51 Mustang, with its North American-designed airframe and British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, had the range to accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back. It could fly 1,650 miles at 300 mph, staying with the bombers from England to Berlin. It was a game-changer. The German command, however, did not fully appreciate the significance of the Mustang. They had seen American fighters before. They had shot them down. They assumed the Mustang would be just another American fighter to be defeated. They were wrong. The German underestimation of the Mustang was symptomatic of a deeper problem. The German command had a limited understanding of American industrial capacity. They did not appreciate that the United States could produce thousands of Mustangs, train thousands of pilots, and sustain a fighter offensive that would eventually overwhelm the Luftwaffe. The German command's failure to prioritize long-range fighter production was another factor. The Luftwaffe's own fighter production had been focused on interceptors for homeland defense. The Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was delayed due to a combination of technical problems, production difficulties, and Hitler's personal interference. By the time the Me-262 was introduced in 1944, it was too late. The German command was also plagued by strategic confusion. The Luftwaffe's high command, led by Göring, was rife with incompetence and infighting. Generals like Hans Jescheneck, the Luftwaffe's chief of staff, exemplified the arrogance of the German leadership. Jescheneck had remarked in 1942 that he would not know what to do with a production of more than 300 fighters per month. It was a statement of breathtaking strategic blindness. The turning point in the air war over Europe came in February 1944, with Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. This was the climax of the combined bomber offensive, a massive assault on the German aircraft industry designed to destroy the Luftwaffe on the ground and in the air. During Big Week, the 8th Air Force launched a series of devastating attacks on German aircraft factories, airfields, and associated targets. The Americans used their new long-range fighters to full effect, meeting the Luftwaffe in the air and overwhelming them with superior numbers and tactics. The Luftwaffe was forced to fight, and it was forced to lose. By the end of Big Week, the German fighter force had been crippled. The Allies assessed that the Luftwaffe was sufficiently degraded and that it was time to shift attention to other targets. The psychological impact of Big Week was immense. The German pilots who survived were shocked by the scale of the American assault. They had never seen anything like it. They had been fighting a defensive war against a relentless, seemingly unstoppable enemy. The American fighter pilots were aggressive, well-trained, and flying superior aircraft. The German pilots were tired, outnumbered, and increasingly demoralized. The German command's response to Big Week was confused and ineffective. Göring, humiliated by his failure, retreated further into his own delusions. Hitler, enraged by the failure of the Luftwaffe, refused to acknowledge the reality of the American air offensive. The German command was paralyzed by its own arrogance. The American bombing offensive also had a devastating psychological impact on the German civilian population. The German people had been told that they were the master race, that they would win the war, that their enemies were weak. The American bombs, raining down on their cities, shattered this illusion. The war was not going to be won. It was going to be lost. The psychological warfare aspect of the American bombing offensive was a crucial factor in the German collapse. The American bombers did not just destroy factories, they destroyed morale. They shattered the German people's faith in their government and their military leadership. The Luftwaffe's inability to protect German cities from American bombing also had a profound impact. The German people saw that the Luftwaffe had failed them. The promise of total victory had been replaced by the reality of total defeat. The technological and strategic impact of the 8th Air Force's offensive was immense. The American bombers had destroyed the German aircraft industry, the Luftwaffe had been broken in the air, and the German war economy had been crippled. The 8th Air Force's operations continued until the German surrender in May 1945. It had dropped over 600,000 tons of bombs, destroyed hundreds of German aircraft, and killed tens of thousands of German military personnel. The 8th Air Force had also suffered heavy losses. Over 26,000 American airmen had been killed, and thousands more had been captured or wounded. The cost of victory was staggering. But the strategic impact was undeniable. The American bombing offensive had been a decisive factor in the defeat of Nazi Germany. It had disrupted German production, destroyed the Luftwaffe, and sapped the morale of the German people. It had made possible the Allied invasion of Normandy and the ultimate victory of the Western Allies. The question that haunts the history of the 8th Air Force is a simple one. Why did the Germans not appreciate the threat earlier? Why did they underestimate the American ability to build and sustain a strategic bombing offensive? The answer lies in a combination of arrogance, ignorance, and institutional failure. The German command was a product of a totalitarian regime that had suppressed dissent and discouraged independent thinking. The German generals had been conditioned to believe in the superiority of their own nation and the weakness of their enemies. They could not conceive of a nation that was more powerful, more resilient, or more innovative than Germany. The German command was also a product of a military tradition that emphasized tactical brilliance over strategic planning. The Germans were masters of the battlefield, but they were poor strategists. They won battles, but they lost wars. The German command's underestimation of the 8th Air Force was a catastrophic failure of intelligence. It was a failure to recognize the reality of American industrial and military power. It was a failure that cost Germany the war. The story of why German command underestimated the U.S. 8th Air Force is a story of a moment of truth. It is a story of the psychological collapse of the German command, of the shattering of illusions, and of the brutal reality of defeat. The German command was not weak. It was a product of a military tradition that had produced some of the most brilliant military leaders in history. But it was also a product of a political system that had corrupted military professionalism and replaced it with ideological faith. The underestimation of the 8th Air Force was a symptom of a deeper rot. It was a sign that the German command had lost touch with reality. It was a sign that the Nazi regime had destroyed its own military effectiveness. The ultimate legacy of the 8th Air Force is a complex one. It was a symbol of American power and ingenuity, but it was also a symbol of the destruction of the old world order. It helped to defeat the Nazi regime, but it also contributed to the rise of the Cold War. It was a source of pride for Americans, but it was also a source of resentment for many Germans. As we reflect on this history, we are left with a haunting question. Why did the Germans not learn the lesson of the American bombing offensive? Why did they continue to fight when the war was clearly lost? The answer is as complex as the war itself, involving ideology, fear, and the refusal to accept defeat. In the end, the German command's underestimation of the 8th Air Force was a powerful statement. It was the silence of a man who had nothing left to say, who had run out of words, who had reached the end of his road. It was the silence of a man who had finally understood the nature of his defeat. And in that silence, we can hear the echoes of a war that reshaped the world.